Hey guys, and welcome to the first of our two-part lecture series on Rome. This one's going to be about Rome's transition from a kingdom to a republic to an empire. These are the important concepts I want you to know by the end of this presentation, but I also don't want you guys to forget about the Conrad Demarest model, especially when we start talking about Rome as an empire. This is going to be a model that stays with us through Rome and some other empires we'll talk about in the coming weeks. Here's some of your key vocabulary for Rome. You're going to see all these appear in the textbook, and some of them I'm going to pay particular attention to today as well. Okay, so like I said, we're talking about the transition that Rome had from a kingdom to a republic to an empire. We're also talking about how that transition affected the other territories and the other peoples that Rome came into contact with. And that transition took about 700 years or so, from the 700s BCE to right around the year 0, and it's the first part of chapter 6 of Spodak. Okay, so before we start talking about the history of Rome, which is right there by the way, let's start talking about its geography and the surroundings of Rome, what eventually became the Roman Empire. We call the area that's on this map that Rome had a pretty heavy cultural influence on, we call it the Mediterranean region. And if you guys had human geography last year, you might have talked about geography in terms of physical geography or political geography or in terms of continents. Here I kind of want to talk about cultural geography. When I talk about the Mediterranean region, obviously I'm not talking about a continent, right? Because Europe is over here, Africa's down here, Asia's over here. Those are all separate continents, but I'm talking about cultural geography, a region that has certain aspects of its culture that it holds in common. So when we talk about the Mediterranean region, we group it as a region in world history because there are certain cultural similarities that people in that region share. Why do they share those cultural similarities? Well, in part, it's going to be because of the impact that the Roman Empire has on bringing those people together and diffusing its culture so that it can be shared by all the people of that region, that Mediterranean region. What themes are we talking about here? Whenever we talk about cultural diffusion, we should be thinking about theme 2, development and interaction, keyword interaction of cultures. The AP exam loves to ask about interaction of cultures, so make sure that remains a focus for you guys in your studies. Alright, so I just made a big stink about how Rome was responsible for diffusing a lot of its culture around the Mediterranean, and that's why we call it the Mediterranean region. But it's also important for us to remember that cultural diffusion is a two-way street. Rome not only introduced its culture to surrounding regions, but it took in the culture of those regions, and those cultures changed Rome itself. So really, we can talk about Rome as a borrower of cultures, as well as Rome as a lender of cultures. As a borrower, many of you guys already know that it borrowed its religious beliefs from the Greeks, its polytheistic beliefs in many gods. And later on, it adopted Christianity, which it borrowed from outsiders as well. It borrowed shipbuilding techniques from the Carthaginians, who you'll read about. It borrowed its language from the nearby Etruscan people and also the Greeks. If you are looking at this Etruscan alphabet here, and some of the characters are looking eerily familiar, well, they should, because the Etruscans influenced the Romans, and the Romans influenced many other languages, including English. Here are some of the things that Rome diffused to other territories, to other peoples, to other cultures. One of the main things that it brought with it was engineering accomplishments. Aqueducts, pictured in your textbook, as well as bathhouses. There's actually one pictured right here. These are the Roman baths in England. And yes, for the record, that is me as a much cooler college kid. Check out that hair. Man, I miss that hair. Anyway, most of the borrowed culture that Rome took from over here was also diffused to conquered territories. So they took that Etruscan language, modified it, and diffused it to those conquered territories. They took their religious beliefs and they spread them to those territories, which, when we start talking about Christianity, we'll learn is one of the reasons that Christianity is able to spread relatively quickly throughout Europe. Okay, so real quickly and in one slide, let's talk about Rome as a kingdom. That time period lasted about 200 years or so, from the 700s to the 500s, and Rome was ruled by the Etruscans, who we just talked about on the last slide, the same folks who gave Rome some really heavy linguistic influences. While some people were okay with Etruscan kings, the wealthiest, most powerful Roman residents, the Roman elite, weren't satisfied with not really being on top of the social order. They were one notch below, so they rebelled and they kicked the king out and they created what's called a republic. What themes we're talking about here? You know, whenever politics come into play, it's theme 3. If we're talking about social structures, it's always going to be theme 5. Okay, so we might think when we create the republic, it must mean progress, right? Republic is a good thing, right? It's like democracy, right? Well, not always. Although things got slightly more democratic, they weren't nearly the kind of democracy we envision when we think of that word today. Power went from being concentrated in the hands of a king to being concentrated in the hands of about 10% of the population of Rome, the Roman elite. And things actually got worse for many people in Rome at the time. So it's progress really for some people, but not for others. For the elites, who were called the patricians, by the way, that's a vocab term, don't forget, they got a boost in their political power and their influence, and they got to take over lots of parts of the society, like leadership of the military, leadership of the religion. So that further influence or further boost their influence. For the commoners, who were called the plebeians, another vocabulary term, things were not so great. They still didn't have any say. They didn't have any under the king. They didn't have any under the elites. And things didn't really change for them. In fact, in some ways, things kind of got worse because the patricians came up with this system of laws called the 12 Tables, which we'll see later on. And you'll notice when you read this that there's the same kind of social class divisions that you read about when we talked about Hammurabi's Code. What themes we're talking about here? Same ones, right? Politics, social structures. It is necessary, though, to say that after some time, some things got a little bit better for the plebeians. They had these folks called tribunes, which is a vocab term from your textbook, that were elected to protect their rights, and eventually, about 150 years after the formation of the Republic, they get one of their own elected to the office of consul which was the highest government office. So things got a little bit better, but still they weren't considered equal to the Roman elite. Hey look, same themes again and again. Are we seeing a trend? Hope so. Okay, so let's fast forward from the creation of the Republic in the 500s, a couple hundred years to the 200s BCE, which is when Rome really starts to expand its territory throughout the Mediterranean. And you'll find in your textbook reading that sometimes they treated their conquered territories with a policy of hegemony or hegemony, depending on how you want to say it, and sometimes they adopted a strategy that was more dominant in nature. I kind of gone a little bit T-chart crazy on you so far today, but I think they're kind of important for us to compare and contrast the differences in how the Romans ran the Republic and eventually their empire. What are some examples of hegemonic strategies they use? You can see a couple over here. You'll see these in the textbook as well. Some examples of dominance are over here. So really, they're not all hegemonic or all dominant. The way they treated the territory really had to do with who might have been in power of the Roman leadership at that time, who might have been in charge of the territory that Rome conquered, and how well that leader was able to deal with an expanding Roman territory. Okay, so again, real quick in one slide, let's go over the transition from Rome as a republic to Rome as an empire. And this transition is complete sometime around the year 0. We don't really focus on exact dates here, but know it happens around the year 0. That's a good time to remember. This is an oversimplified version of events, but I had to cram it all into one slide to make it work. So here we go. Some causes of the transition from republic to empire. One of the first causes is something we've already talked about: really unequal distribution of wealth. You had what's called bread and circuses, or free food and entertainment given out to people to keep them from revolting. The problem with that is that there were still very few rich people and very many upset poor people, and the free food did not solve the unemployment problem that caused hunger. So the government was kind of putting a band-aid on the problem and not solving the root cause of the problem, and so the problem persisted. When you have in any society a huge gap between rich and poor, that tends to lead to rebellion in many cases. Okay, many of those poor people were actually soldiers who were paid not by the Roman government but paid directly by their commanders. So, as you can guess, the soldiers weren't really loyal to Rome, but they were loyal to their commanders. Okay, and that makes a big impact when we start to see a civil war start in Rome. One of those army commanders, by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar, you've probably heard of this guy, gains popularity not only among his troops, but pretty much among the Roman populace as a whole. And this starts to really cause folks that were his political rivals in the Roman government to feel threatened by him. And so they say, hey, you better break up your army, because they didn't like the fact that this popular guy had all these folks with weapons supporting him. Caesar's response to that is he takes that as a threat and says, no, I'm not going to break up my army. There's a civil war. Caesar wins, names himself dictator for life. If you do the reading, you'll know what a dictator in Roman history is. It's different from the concept of dictator you might be familiar with, but he calls himself dictator for life. Winds up getting himself killed over that because he still had enough rivals who thought he shouldn't have that much power, but his adopted son, who kind of has the pity vote or the sympathy vote after his dad gets killed, goes into another civil war with a bunch of other political rivals and emerges victorious and sets up the beginnings of the Roman Empire. That's a whole lot of information I know on one slide for you. Here's what's not so important is the names of the individuals involved. What is much more important is the idea of causes and effects. Big cause being unequal distribution of wealth, okay? Also who the soldiers were loyal to. So focus more so on the big trends than you focus on the individuals' names. Okay, so all that stuff I just said on the last slide is not nearly as important as what's on this slide. Okay, we often talk about civilizations in isolation. You know, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus, China, now the Roman Empire, right? But what's way more important to world historians, and what's way more important on the AP exam, is when societies interact with one another and you get that trade in goods but also in ideas, when you get that cultural diffusion. And it's around this time period that that cultural diffusion really starts. Okay, we're in a brand new time period here that the AP exam tests, and it starts around this time for a reason, because it's around this time that empires, that civilizations really start interacting with each other on a much more detailed, advanced level. Okay, what you're looking at right here is a map of trade routes that existed around this time in the Eastern Hemisphere. You may have heard about what's here in red, the Silk Roads. We'll talk more about those later. You may not have heard about the Indian Ocean sea lanes. We'll talk more about those as well. But what you need to know, at least for this point in time, is that Rome, and the Roman Empire over here, was part of a much, much bigger trade network that spanned across Afro-Eurasia. Okay? There were goods coming from, at this point, the far east all the way to the east coast of China that eventually made their way as far west as Rome, and vice versa. Goods were traveling from the Roman Empire in the west all the way to China in the east. These were some of the goods that were exchanged. Most importantly, from Rome, you've got precious metals, mostly gold and silver, flowing east in exchange for silk and spices, among other goods from the east that are flowing west. Okay, we will talk about these trade routes in much more detail later, but for right now, you need to know that the Roman Empire was a big player in these trade routes. Okay, and when we talk about Han Dynasty China and Gupta India later on, you'll see that they were a big player in these trade routes as well. And that's it for this segment of the lecture.